Uniswap matched the Coinbase volume, and then you saw like SushiSwap come in, and they did this vampire attack where they airdropped all their tokens to the Uniswap customers and like stole their liquidity. I mean, it was crazy. And you're like, wow, this really is decentralized, because you could take someone's liquidity. Normally, to take JP Morgan's liquidity would take you 20, 30, 40, 50 years because you couldn't actually steal it with tokens.
The SEC would shut you down before you did it, because JP Morgan would call the henchmen at the SEC and say, nope, get those guys out of business. So it never happened.
Yeah. And so I guess that comes to my next question is that we know the banks, we know the banking industry, we know Wall Street. How will they, or can they, sit by and watch, DeFi come in and potentially remove people from having a bank as their middleman with every transaction in their life? I mean, most people don't realize that their banks control their lives, their brains, every moment of their day via some financial transaction. How does that transition happen, or does it?
I believe it does, not completely. I believe, let me take this in a few points here, right? Number one is, just to answer your question directly, when we were growing up, you saw these technologies come out, these amazing new technologies, and there was typically a few different versions. Then it would get narrowed down to two. You had Betamax and you had VHS. Yeah. And then suddenly just one starts to take hold, the network effect starts, and next thing you know, it's impossible to have two types of technology because everyone's on VHS, so the people don't want to make their stuff, the content for beta. And even though beta was actually a better technology and clearer pictures, VHS won out. We saw the same thing happen with Laserdisc and Blu-ray. Blu-ray won the match. We saw it happen, and many times before that, where you have like you have multiple people in the game, and then one side wins. But then we see other cases where we have two winners. And I guess the best example that I think is going to mirror what's going to happen with DeFi and crypto and the mainstream financial institutions is Apple and Android. Apple represents centralized institutions. They control everything. It's a tight-knit community. It's closed. You have to go through this one place and no one could use it. Versus Android is basically open source technology somewhat, where people can sort of have all these different companies can use Android. Hence why there's far more volume in Android than there is in Apple's 30%, 20% of the market. Yeah. Android is 70 maybe, but it's made up of 1,000 different companies, while Apple is one company. So it's the best, and they have certain advantages by being a closed ecosystem and control and user experience that gives Apple a huge edge. And also Apple's an amazing brand. But you notice you have these two independent technologies that run side by side. And now in the early days, if you had an Apple computer, you couldn't run Microsoft programs. And ultimately, they created links to the two over time. And they started to talk to each other, and you can get off and on, and all the on-ramps and off-ramps between Google Play and Apple Store and their, everything that happens with all those ecosystems, right? They start to talk to each other. I think that's what's going to happen with centralized financial institutions and DeFi. Ultimately, DeFi will be much larger than centralized institutions. But what you're going to have is on-ramps and off-ramps, like we're already seeing right now, where you go from the decentralized world into the centralized world. And I think based on how the governments ultimately shake this out with regulation, because there's all the KYC issues, there's sovereign monetary policy. So I think you can't hold back the technology of DeFi to make it smaller than central institutions. It's going to be DeFi is going to be much bigger. But I don't think you'll see the disappearance of centralized institutions in our lifetime. I think you're going to see DeFi taking off, and then centralized institutions being the gatekeepers back into the mainstream financial institutions, and they'll talk to each other until they're almost like one and the same. And you'll probably see the big institutions trying to take over the DeFi companies, and if we can't beat them, join them, and hopefully take over them. I think that's going to happen very quickly. That's the answer to your question. So, one more point here, but I think one thing we definitely need to discuss is that DeFi is not just SushiSwap and Pancake. There's all these other DeFi protocols out there right now, countless. They're launching every day, some good, many that are not good, using the name DeFi to, again, create situations of like their own version of a shitcoin. But so, DeFi is much more than just that Pancake swap and Sushi swap. There's much more than that.
Right. So just people need to be aware of and still evaluate each protocol and each coin separately. Just because it's DeFi doesn't mean it's great.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I agree with you. I don't think the banks will just pick up and go home. I mean, they have massive control over like all of our lives, all of our brains, the government, et cetera. So they want to be a part of this going forward, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays. You know, we talked about regulation earlier, but maybe we just get the last bit of regulation here. How do you think this ultimately is regulated? Do you think it happens by the SEC, the FDIC? Do you think it's going to be KYC everywhere to where when I plug into a Uniswap at some point there will be KYC? And you made another great point. You said you might want the SEC to regulate this because when the district attorney gets involved, you know, you go to prison. And so there also is
a much better alternative.
Right. You're the first one to ever make that point. But lately you see a lot of government institutions trying to get involved in the regulation. It used to be just Gary Gensler versus the world at the SEC, but now it seems everybody's involved. So I don't know, where do you think that goes? And then stablecoins is the big issue. How will they regulate that or try to create their own?
So, number one, I think the chance, I'm going to make a bold guess here, that they're going to form an entirely new regulatory body that regulates cryptocurrency. I'm just going to guess there's going to be an entirely new independent body that will be formed in the same way that we didn't have Homeland Security a bunch of years ago. We just had like all these different things. They actually formed Homeland Security, which had sort of, you know, jurisdiction over a lot of different things. I have a feeling they're going to come up with a new label. Great thing to spend money on for a central government is with a new label and build something from scratch. Why, you know, just make it part of the SEC where you can waste money building it from scratch somewhere else, right? So I think that you'll see it'll include voices from the CFTC, the SEC, maybe the NASD, and also the English counterparts. What is it? You have the FCA there.
FCA now, yeah, the FCA,
right over in London. So I think you'll see some something like that happen. But I think the real, listen, there's two aspects of this. One is disclosure, like the need for adequate disclosure, which is sorely lacking right now. And that's a huge, huge problem in the crypto world. That's number one. The second thing, which is the bad part, is the last thing you want is the government or any agency or regulator calling balls and strikes, trying to say what's good and what's bad. The day they start trying to do that is the day it's over. And I think the government knows that because all of U.S. securities laws is designed to not call balls and strikes. They're not going to say this is good, this is bad. They'll just say, you better tell people how much we think it sucks. Like you have to tell them how bad it is. And if you do, then it's the buyer beware. So I think that's really needed. I think that you have to have an adequate disclosure mechanism for people to invest in crypto. In the absence of that, you have just too many unscrupulous players that take advantage.